My mother didn't even look at me when she said it. She leaned close enough that I could smell her perfume, expensive and floral, and whispered, "Know your place. You're embarrassing us." I stood there in the middle of the ballroom, surrounded by chandeliers and crystal glasses, realizing there was no chair with my name on it, no place setting, no acknowledgement that I belonged to this family at all. My sister-in-law's lips curled into a smile that wasn't meant for kindness. "We only save seats for elite guests," she murmured, her voice sugar-coated and sharp. "The useless ones serve." My brother didn't argue. He didn't even hesitate. He adjusted his cufflinks, glanced at me as if I were a problem to be managed, and said, "Just stop making a scene." So I stayed silent. I didn't defend myself. I didn't walk out. I stood exactly where they pushed me, near the edge of the room, half a step away from the service corridor, and let them pretend they didn't know me. What they didn't understand was that I wasn't there to be seen. I was there to wait. And when the right person walked into that room, everything they believed about me was about to collapse. The gala continued around me as if nothing unusual had happened. Music drifted from the string quartet. Laughter rose and fell in practiced waves. Glasses clinked, heels clicked, and conversations about donations and influence flowed effortlessly. No one questioned why I was standing while everyone else was seated. In rooms like this, invisibility is enforced by assumption. People see what they expect to see, and my family had trained everyone to expect that I didn't matter. I stayed where I was, close enough to the service corridor that waitstaff brushed past me with trays balanced on their palms. A woman in a sequined gown handed me her empty champagne flute without looking up. "Thank you," she said absently. I took it from her hand and placed it on a passing tray. My parents saw it happen. Neither of them corrected her. My mother approached again a few minutes later, her smile immaculate for anyone watching. Her voice was low, polite, almost gentle. "Why don't you stand closer to the service entrance?" she said. "People might get confused." Confused. As if my presence alone disrupted the careful illusion she'd built. I nodded once and stepped where she directed, feeling the familiar weight of compliance settle over me. This wasn't new. This was how she'd always handled me. Quietly, efficiently, without witnesses who might ask questions. I looked to my brother then, just for a second. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. We locked eyes, and for a heartbeat I saw hesitation. Then he looked away, smoothing the front of his jacket, choosing comfort over loyalty. That small movement hurt more than my mother's words ever could. Silence, I had learned, was his favorite defense. My sister-in-law drifted over next, her posture relaxed, her tone falsely warm. "You're so dedicated," she said, glancing at the tray I'd just touched. "Always helping." A few people nearby laughed softly, unsure if it was a joke. She watched their reactions carefully, measuring her power in their discomfort. This was her element. Social hierarchy, delivered with a smile. I didn't correct her. I didn't explain who I was or why I was there. Speaking would have given them something to push against. Silence kept my position undefined, and for the first time in my life, that felt like control. The truth was, I could have left at any moment. No one was blocking the exits. No one was holding me there. But I wasn't staying because I needed them. I was staying because I was waiting for someone else. Someone my family had been trying, unsuccessfully, to reach for months. My phone vibrated once in my hand. No message, just a signal. 10 minutes. Around the room, the energy began to shift. I felt it before I saw it, the way you feel pressure change before a storm. Conversations grew sharper, more alert. My father straightened his shoulders and scanned the entrance. My mother subtly repositioned herself closer to the center of the room. My brother checked his reflection in a mirrored column. My sister-in-law smoothed her hair and smiled at no one in particular. They were getting ready to perform. I stayed exactly where I was. Whispers started to ripple through the crowd. Names I recognized. Expectations spoken under breath. The man they were waiting for was late, and lateness like that meant power. Staff became suddenly attentive. Security shifted their stance. The music softened without being asked. I watched my parents exchange a look that mixed hope with anxiety. Everything they'd built this evening around depended on a single introduction, a single conversation. They believed proximity would be enough. They believed they could control access. They still thought I served here. The doors at the far end of the ballroom opened, and the room leaned toward the sound as one. Conversations dropped into silence. I didn't turn right away. I didn't need to. I already knew the moment I'd been waiting for had arrived. The music swelled again, just loud enough to convince everyone that nothing had gone wrong. Laughter returned in careful bursts, and conversations resumed as if humiliation were just another decorative detail of the evening. I remained standing near the service corridor, invisible by consensus. No one questioned it. In rooms like this, people accept hierarchy without thinking. If someone is standing while others sit, there must be a reason. And if my family treated me like staff, then staff was what I became in their eyes. A waiter brushed past me, murmuring an apology. Another handed me a folded napkin by mistake before realizing I wasn't one of them. I handed it back with a small nod. A man I barely recognized pressed an empty glass into my hand without looking up, already turning away mid-sentence to chase a better conversation. I took the glass and placed it on a passing tray. The exchange lasted seconds. The implication lingered. My mother noticed everything. She always did. That was part of the cruelty. She crossed the room again, this time with a donor at her side, laughing lightly, performing warmth. As soon as they passed, she slowed just enough to murmur, "Stand closer to the door. People are starting to stare." Her smile never faltered. Her voice never rose. This was not anger. This was management. I moved where she indicated, closer to the service entrance, the boundary where guests stopped and staff began. The air felt different there, cooler, less perfumed. I had stood in places like this my entire life, just out of frame, just out of mind. The difference tonight was that I could see the pattern clearly. They weren't embarrassed of me. They were afraid of confusion. Confusion threatened order, and order was the only thing my parents had ever truly loved. I looked at my brother again. This time I didn't expect anything. He was laughing at something my father said, glass raised, posture relaxed. He caught my eye for a brief moment, then looked away, fingers adjusting his watch as if it were suddenly uncomfortable. That small gesture landed harder than any insult. It told me everything I needed to know. Silence wasn't neutrality. Silence was a choice. And he had made it. My sister-in-law appeared beside me once more, as if summoned by the imbalance. She tilted her head, studying me with polite curiosity, the way you examine something that doesn't quite belong. "You're very committed," she said lightly. "Always so helpful." Her eyes flicked toward the tray of glasses nearby, then back to my face. A few people within earshot smiled uncertainly. No one objected. She enjoyed this part, I could tell. The power wasn't in the insult itself, but in the way everyone else accepted it. She was defining the hierarchy out loud, and no one corrected her. Not even me. I could have spoken then. I could have told her she was wrong. I could have corrected the narrative, explained my presence, reclaimed my name. But I didn't. Speaking would have given them control of the moment. Silence kept the story unfinished, and unfinished stories make people uncomfortable. They thought I wanted something from them. That was the mistake. They thought I wanted approval, reconciliation, a seat at their table. They believed my presence was an act of desperation. It never occurred to them that I might be there for reasons that had nothing to do with them at all. I caught fragments of conversation drifting from a nearby cluster of guests. Words like final decision, tonight, and approval floated through the air. My father's voice was low and tense when he spoke, measured in a way it only became when something important was on the line. My mother nodded too quickly, eyes scanning the room as if searching for someone who wasn't there yet. They were waiting. and they were worried. That worry was the first crack. My phone vibrated again in my hand, subtle enough that no one noticed. Still no message. Just the quiet assurance that everything was moving on schedule. I exhaled slowly, grounding myself. This wasn't about enduring humiliation. This was about timing. And timing had always been my strength. A guest brushed past me and paused, frowning slightly. "Excuse me," she said, glancing from my face to the corridor behind me. "Are you with the event?" The question was polite, reasonable, and completely wrong. I met her eyes and smiled faintly. Before I could answer, my mother's voice cut in from across the room, sharp with artificial cheer. "She's helping us tonight," she said quickly. "Family does what it can." The guest nodded, satisfied, and moved on. Helping. Family. The words settled between us like dust. My mother didn't look back. She didn't need to. She believed she had resolved the issue. I felt something shift inside me then. Not anger, not hurt, but clarity. They truly believed I was dependent on their permission to exist in this space. They believed I was trapped by their narrative. And because they believed that, they were blind to everything else. The room began to change again. Conversations lowered. Heads turned, not toward me but toward the entrance. Staff straightened. Security adjusted their stance. The air tightened, as if everyone had collectively taken a breath and was holding it. My parents moved instinctively, stepping closer together, positioning themselves where they thought they would be seen first. My brother smoothed his tie. My sister-in-law checked her reflection in a nearby mirror, smile rehearsed and ready. I stayed where I was, near the service corridor, hands relaxed at my sides. They still believed I served here, and they had no idea how close they were to finding out how wrong they were. The way my mother said my name that night pulled something loose inside me, something old and familiar. It wasn't loud or sharp. It was clipped, controlled, the same tone she had used my entire life when I didn't fit neatly into whatever image she was presenting. Standing near the service corridor, watching her glide through the room as if she owned it, I felt the past press up against the present until the line between them blurred. I had been the child who never quite fit the picture they wanted to frame. Growing up, our house was always immaculate, staged like a model home. Every dinner felt like a rehearsal. Posture mattered. Silence mattered. Saying the right thing mattered more than saying something true. My brother learned early how to perform. He mirrored my father's opinions, followed the approved path, and accepted praise without questioning why it came so easily to him. When he succeeded, it reflected well on the family. When I asked questions, it was seen as disruption. I remember sitting at that long dining table when I was young, my feet barely touching the floor, listening to my parents talk about futures as if they were contracts already signed. Law, finance, respectable things. When they looked at my brother, their faces softened with certainty. When they looked at me, there was always a pause, as if they were trying to calculate where I had gone wrong. I wasn't rebellious. I wasn't reckless. I was curious. I wanted to understand how things worked, why certain rules existed, who benefited from them. That curiosity unsettled my parents. It embarrassed them when I asked the wrong questions in front of the wrong people. They preferred compliance. I preferred clarity. Somewhere along the way, that difference became a problem they decided not to solve. There was a moment, years ago, that changed everything. I was old enough to know better, according to them, and young enough to still believe honesty mattered. We were at a social event, another polished gathering full of people who measured worth in titles and last names. Someone asked me what I wanted to do with my life, and I answered honestly. I said I wanted to build something of my own. I said I didn't want to follow a path just because it looked good from the outside. The silence that followed was immediate and heavy. Later that night, behind closed doors, my parents told me I had humiliated them. Not because I'd said anything cruel, but because I'd said something unpredictable. My father's disappointment was quiet and final. My mother's anger was sharp, delivered in the language of concern. They didn't shout, they didn't threaten, they simply withdrew. From that point on, I was labeled difficult, unreliable, a risk. Invitations became less frequent. Expectations lowered. When my brother succeeded, it was celebrated. When I achieved something, it was acknowledged politely, then dismissed. I learned that approval was conditional, and I had failed to meet the conditions. Leaving didn't cause the rupture people like to imagine. There was no dramatic fight, no slammed doors. I moved away quietly, built a life that didn't require their permission, and waited to see if anyone would notice. They didn't. The family continued on without me, smoother, simpler, unchallenged. My absence solved a problem they'd never wanted to address. Standing in that ballroom years later, watching my brother laugh easily with people who adored him, I understood something I hadn't back then. My disappearance hadn't been a loss to them. It had been a convenience. The music swelled again, pulling me back into the present. A burst of laughter snapped the memory loose, and the bright lights of the gala replaced the dim familiarity of childhood. I straightened slightly, grounding myself where I stood. I wasn't that child anymore. I wasn't waiting to be chosen. They had no idea who I was now, and that ignorance was the one advantage they couldn't take from me. My parents still believed the version of me they had written off years ago. The failure, the embarrassment. The daughter who didn't follow instructions and therefore must have fallen behind. Everything they said that night was shaped by that belief. The service entrance, the comments, the ease with which they erased me. It all made sense if you assumed I had nothing to offer. I watched them from a distance, studying their movements the way I once studied markets and negotiations. My father's confidence was slightly too rigid. My mother's smile didn't reach her eyes. My brother's laughter came half a second too late. They were all playing roles they'd rehearsed for decades, unaware that the audience had changed. They thought they knew my place because they had assigned it to me long ago. I had learned, in the years they hadn't been watching, that the most dangerous thing you can do to someone like my parents is let them underestimate you. They confuse silence with weakness. They mistake absence for failure. They believe power is inherited, passed down like a family heirloom, when in reality it's built quietly by those willing to work without applause. The room shifted again, subtle but undeniable. Conversations lowered. A ripple of anticipation moved through the crowd. I felt calm settle over me, steady and familiar. The past no longer had its grip on me. It had simply explained how we arrived here. I stayed where I was, near the edge of the room, no longer small, no longer uncertain. They might have erased me from their story, but tonight I was about to rewrite it entirely. And for the first time, I didn't need them to see me to know exactly who I was. I came fully back into the room with a kind of clarity that surprised me. The memories faded, and the gala sharpened into focus again, all light and noise and carefully curated importance. I was still standing near the service corridor, still unnoticed by most, but the weight of the past no longer pressed on my shoulders. Tonight wasn't about what had been done to me. It was about what was about to happen. This gala mattered far more than my family wanted anyone to realize. On the surface, it was charity, elegance, generosity performed in tailored suits and silk gowns. Underneath, it was leverage. Decisions were being shaped here, relationships cemented or quietly dismissed. My parents hadn't co-sponsored this event for goodwill. They had done it because they needed something, and they needed it badly. I could see it in my father's movements. He kept glancing toward the entrance, his jaw tightening each time the doors opened for someone who wasn't the person he was waiting for. My mother floated from group to group, laughter perfectly timed, eyes always scanning. She was positioning herself, calculating angles, making sure she would be seen by the right people at the right moment. This night was meant to crown years of effort. It was supposed to secure their future. And they had no idea how fragile that future actually was. The truth was, I hadn't come back because I missed them. I hadn't come back hoping for reconciliation or recognition. I was here because I had been invited, not by my parents, not by my brother, and certainly not by my sister-in-law, who still believed I should be grateful just to stand in the room. My invitation had come quietly, professionally, without ceremony. A message sent through channels my family didn't even know existed. If they had known who had asked me to be here, they wouldn't have dared speak to me the way they did. They believed I wanted something from them. That belief shaped every interaction. My mother's instructions, my sister-in-law's smirk, my brother's silence. They thought I was lingering out of desperation, hoping someone might eventually take pity on me and pull out a chair. They couldn't imagine a version of me that didn't revolve around their approval. I had built my life far away from their table. I felt the risk of it all then, settling in my chest. This wasn't a symbolic stand or a petty moment of revenge. If tonight went wrong, the consequences would ripple outward, reputations, livelihoods, futures, mine included. I wasn't immune to failure just because I had learned to be quiet. I was taking a calculated risk, trusting timing and preparation over emotion. My phone vibrated again, once, discreetly. No message, just confirmation. 5 minutes. The room was changing. Not dramatically, not yet, but enough that anyone paying attention could feel it. Staff became more alert, adjusting positions, murmuring into earpieces. A cluster of guests shifted closer to the entrance, anticipation sharpening their expressions. My parents gravitated toward the same area, instinctively aligning themselves where they believed importance would pass. They thought proximity was power. I stayed where I was. A man near me leaned toward his companion and whispered something I couldn't quite hear. She nodded, eyes bright with expectation. My mother laughed a little too loudly at a joke that hadn't been that funny. My father checked his watch, then smoothed the front of his jacket. My brother straightened his tie. My sister-in-law glanced at her reflection in a mirrored column and adjusted her smile, readying herself for admiration. They were rehearsing, all of them, performing for an audience they believed would reward them for their effort. I wasn't rehearsing anything. I didn't need to. I knew exactly why this moment mattered, and I knew exactly what would happen when the right person walked into the room. My family's entire strategy depended on controlling access, on deciding who was seen and who was ignored. They had spent years perfecting that skill, using it to elevate themselves and diminish anyone who didn't fit neatly into their vision. They had used it on me for most of my life. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same tactic they used to erase me was about to render them irrelevant. The doors at the far end of the ballroom opened again, wider this time. The music softened, then paused altogether. Conversations fell into a hush that spread faster than sound, rippling through the crowd like a held breath. Every instinct in the room oriented toward the entrance. My parents stepped forward together, almost unconsciously placing themselves squarely in the path of arrival. This was their moment. They were certain of it. I felt calm settle over me, deep and steady. No nerves, no fear, just certainty. I didn't move, I didn't look away. I stood exactly where I was meant to stand, near the boundary they had drawn for me, knowing that boundaries only matter until someone powerful decides they don't. As the figure crossed the threshold and the room leaned toward him, I knew the story my family had told about me was about to unravel. Not because I would expose it, and not because I would argue, but because real power was about to walk into the room, and it never asked my parents for permission. The shift in the room was unmistakable. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just a subtle tightening, like a collective inhale everyone forgot to release. The string quartet lowered their volume without being told. Conversations softened, then stalled. Heads began to turn toward the entrance, not out of curiosity, but calculation. I felt it before I saw anything change, the way you sense a storm before the clouds gather. I stayed still. Across the ballroom, my parents reacted instantly. My father straightened his spine and rolled his shoulders back, the posture he used when he wanted to look taller, more important. My mother adjusted her expression into something warm and welcoming, the smile she reserved for people she wanted something from. She drifted closer to the center of the room, placing herself exactly where she believed attention would land. My brother followed suit. He smoothed the front of his jacket, tugged once at his cuff, and angled his body toward the entrance. His face held the faint, practiced confidence of someone who assumed he belonged wherever power gathered. My sister-in-law checked her reflection in a mirrored column and made a small adjustment to her hair, then her smile. She was ready to be admired. They were preparing to perform. Whispers moved through the crowd in low, urgent threads. A name passed from one guest to another. I caught fragments as people leaned close, careful not to be overheard. Approval, funding, influence. My parents had spent months trying to secure this moment. Tonight was supposed to validate everything they had built, every connection they had cultivated. This man was meant to be their prize. They believed proximity was enough. From where I stood, near the service corridor, I could see the pattern clearly. Guests began positioning themselves like pieces on a board, angling for visibility, calculating how close they could get without appearing desperate. The staff grew alert, stepping aside to clear a path. Security shifted their stance, attention focused forward. This wasn't admiration. It was anticipation sharpened by need. I remained exactly where I was. The doors opened wider, and the room leaned toward the sound as one. The man they had been waiting for stepped inside, his presence cutting through the noise without effort. He didn't pause to take in the room. He didn't slow his stride. He moved with the ease of someone who didn't need permission to be anywhere. My parents stepped forward together, perfectly timed, smiles in place. My father opened his mouth to speak, already reaching out his hand. My mother angled her body just enough to be seen beside him. This was the moment they had rehearsed. The man acknowledged them briefly, a nod, a glance that lasted less than a second. Polite, non-committal. He didn't stop. I saw confusion flicker across my father's face, quickly masked by determination. He took a half step forward, trying again, voice low and eager. The man slowed this time, just enough to register the interruption. He offered a courteous response, a few words exchanged without warmth, then continued on his path. Past them. My mother's smile faltered for the first time that evening. My brother froze, his confidence cracking as he realized the interaction wasn't unfolding as planned. My sister-in-law's eyes narrowed slightly, her gaze tracking the man as he moved away from them, recalculating. I watched it all with quiet certainty. The man's attention had shifted. His eyes scanned the room once, then settled in my direction. Not with curiosity, with recognition. He changed course without hesitation, walking past clusters of guests who instinctively moved aside. Conversations died where he passed, replaced by a spreading stillness. I felt the weight of eyes turn toward me, though no one seemed to understand why. He approached, stopping directly in front of me. For a moment the world narrowed to the space between us. I met his gaze calmly, neither surprised nor deferential. He smiled, not broadly, but with something like relief. "There you are," he said, his voice clear enough for those nearest to hear. "We've been waiting." The air in the room froze. I nodded once, a small acknowledgement. No explanation, no theatrics. Just recognition returned. The man gestured slightly toward a private corridor beyond the ballroom, already turning as if the decision had been made long before this moment. Behind me, I felt the room struggling to recalibrate. My father stood rigid, his hand still half extended, champagne forgotten. My mother's expression collapsed into something raw and unguarded, shock breaking through years of control. My brother stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. My sister-in-law's smile slipped entirely, panic flashing beneath the surface. I didn't look back. As I stepped forward, following the man who had just redefined the hierarchy of the room, I felt a strange mixture of relief and resolve. This wasn't triumph. It wasn't vindication. It was the natural consequence of preparation meeting opportunity. We moved away from the noise and light of the ballroom, leaving behind the stunned silence that followed us. I could feel my family's stares on my back, heavy and disoriented. They had spent the entire evening deciding who mattered and who didn't. They had made their choice, and now they were watching the consequences walk away without them. The room didn't erupt the way people expect moments like that to. There was no gasp, no collective murmur, no dramatic pause for effect. There was just silence. Heavy, stunned silence that spread outward from the space between us like a dropped glass shattering in slow motion. The man beside me turned slightly, angling his body toward the private corridor as if the matter were already settled. "They're ready whenever you are," he said, calm and precise. "The board has been waiting." He said it the way people do when they assume authority is understood, when they assume everyone else already knows who's in charge. I nodded. "Then let's not keep them waiting." Behind me, the illusion collapsed. I didn't have to turn around to see it. I could feel it in the way the air shifted, in the way people stopped pretending not to stare. My father's presence loomed, rigid and suddenly small. My mother's practiced composure fractured, her smile evaporating as confusion gave way to fear. My brother's breath caught audibly, disbelief replacing the easy confidence he wore like armor. My sister-in-law stood frozen, her face carefully blank, but I saw the panic flicker through her eyes. Someone nearby whispered my name. Not the way they'd said it before, dismissive or confused, but cautiously, as if testing a new reality. I didn't explain myself. I didn't clarify. I didn't correct a single assumption that had been made about me all night. Explanation would have softened the moment, and I had no interest in making this easier for anyone. The truth didn't need commentary. It stood perfectly well on its own. My mother found her voice first. She always did. "Excuse me," she said brightly, stepping forward, reclaiming her tone before it slipped entirely. "There seems to be some confusion. That's my daughter." She emphasized the word daughter, as if blood alone could reassert control. "We can continue this conversation together." The man beside me didn't even look at her. "I'm aware," he said politely. "And no, we won't." The simplicity of it landed harder than anything cruel could have. My mother stopped short, her confidence faltering in real time. She had spent her life navigating rooms like this, bending people to her will with charm and proximity. She had never encountered someone who simply declined to engage. My father stepped in then, his voice measured but tight. "If there's business to discuss, surely it should go through the appropriate channels." His eyes flicked to me, sharp with something I'd never seen there before. Uncertainty. "This is family business." I finally turned to face him. For the first time that night, I saw fear where authority used to be. "This isn't family business," I said evenly. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "It's mine." The word settled between us, solid and irrevocable. The man beside me checked his watch, already disengaging from the conversation. "We really should go," he said, directing his attention back to me. "Time matters." I stepped forward, and the movement alone was enough to end it. My parents didn't follow. They didn't argue. They couldn't. The hierarchy they relied on had dissolved in front of witnesses, and there was no polite way to reclaim it. As we moved toward the private lounge, the murmurs began. Low at first, then spreading, the room slowly waking from its paralysis. I caught fragments as we passed. "Did he just... That's her? I thought she was..." Assumptions being dismantled one sentence at a time. Inside the lounge, the noise faded, replaced by quiet efficiency. People stood when I entered. Not out of obligation, but recognition. A woman with sharp eyes and a steady demeanor extended her hand. "We're glad you could make it," she said. "I know the timing was unconventional." "Necessary," I replied, shaking her hand. "And effective." We took our seats. Papers were slid across the table, decisions outlined, questions asked and answered without ceremony. The conversation moved quickly, decisively, the way it does when everyone in the room understands the stakes and respects the authority of the person at the center. For 40 minutes, my family didn't exist. When we stood to leave, everything had changed. As we stepped back into the corridor leading toward the ballroom, the man beside me glanced over with a faint smile. "That went exactly as planned," he said. "You handled it well." "I didn't handle anything," I replied. "I just stopped pretending." The ballroom came back into view, still buzzing, still unsteady. My family stood exactly where we had left them, as if afraid to move, to speak, to make the situation worse. My mother's eyes locked onto mine immediately, searching for something to grasp. An explanation, an opening, a mistake. I didn't give her one. I walked past them without slowing, without apology, without triumph. The power wasn't in looking back. It was in not needing to. As I reached the edge of the room, I felt something settle inside me. Not satisfaction, not revenge, something quieter, final. They had told me to know my place. And now, for the first time in my life, I did. The silence I left behind didn't last long. As soon as the doors to the private corridor closed, the ballroom lurched back into motion, like a body waking from shock. Laughter returned too quickly, too loudly. Conversations restarted in fragments, voices overlapping as people tried to pretend they hadn't just watched the room's hierarchy collapse in real time. From the corner of my eye, I saw heads turn as I moved back through the space. Not openly, not yet. Just enough to track me, to reassess. I felt it in the air, that subtle recalibration that happens when people realize they misjudged someone and don't know what to do with the new information. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. My parents had retreated to a small cluster near the bar, their backs angled toward each other, heads close together. They weren't arguing loudly. They didn't need to. Years of partnership had taught them how to communicate panic in whispers. My father's jaw was clenched so tightly I could see the muscle jump beneath his skin. My mother's hands moved as she spoke, too fast, betraying the calm she was trying to project. "This can still be managed," she said, her voice low but sharp. "We just need to control the narrative." "There is no narrative," my father snapped back. "There's what happened." I passed close enough to hear them without slowing. They didn't notice me at first. They were too busy scrambling for ground that no longer existed. My brother stood a few feet away from them, isolated despite his proximity. His drink hung forgotten at his side, ice melting as he stared into nothing. When he finally looked up and saw me, something in his expression shifted. Not anger, not accusation, confusion. The kind that comes when the story you've told yourself for years stops making sense. He stepped toward me, hesitantly, like someone approaching a ledge they hadn't known was there. "Wait," he said quietly. I stopped, but I didn't turn to face him fully. I didn't owe him that yet. "I didn't know," he continued, his voice strained. "I swear I didn't know." I glanced at him then, really looked at him. For the first time, he didn't look like the golden child, polished and certain. He looked small, unmoored. "You never asked," I said. I kept my voice level. "Not once." He flinched, the words landing harder than he expected. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. There was nothing he could say that would undo years of silence. He stepped back, eyes dropping to the floor, and I moved on. Behind him, my sister-in-law was already adapting. She always had been good at that. Her initial shock had hardened into something more calculated. She laughed too brightly at a passing comment, then drifted toward a different group, positioning herself carefully. When her eyes met mine, she smiled, softer this time, almost deferential. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. She would survive this. She would find a way. She always did. I didn't linger to see how. A discreet touch at my elbow guided me toward a side lounge reserved for private conversations. Inside, the atmosphere was different, quieter, focused. People spoke in measured tones, phones pressed briefly to ears, decisions already rippling outward from what had just been agreed upon. This was where consequences were set in motion, not announced. I took a seat near the edge of the room, listening more than speaking. There was nothing to prove here. The work spoke for itself. A message buzzed across my phone, then another. Names I recognized, advisors, partners, a confirmation that things were moving faster than anticipated. Someone had tried to intervene, to insert themselves back into the process, and had been shut down decisively. I didn't need to ask who. Panic makes people reckless. I had learned that long ago. When I returned to the ballroom to retrieve my coat, the energy had shifted again. This time, it wasn't anticipation or excitement. It was unease. People were whispering openly now, no longer pretending discretion. I caught pieces as I passed. "Did you see? I always wondered about her. That changes everything." My parents noticed me immediately. My mother broke away from my father and crossed the room with forced composure, heels clicking too sharply against the marble floor. "We need to talk," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "Not tonight," I replied without stopping. She reached for my arm, then seemed to think better of it, her hand hovering in the air between us. For the first time in my life, she looked unsure of how to handle me. That uncertainty was almost painful to witness. My father joined her, his tone clipped. "You can't just walk away from this." I met his gaze calmly. "I already have." The words landed like a door closing. They stood there as I stepped past them, the space between us widening with every second. I could feel their eyes on my back, heavy and searching, but I didn't turn around. Turning back would have implied there was still something to negotiate. Outside, the night air was cool and grounding. The noise of the gala faded behind me as the doors closed, sealing the room and everything it had represented. I stood there for a moment, breathing, letting the reality settle. Tonight hadn't been an ending. It had been a beginning. My family was still inside, scrambling to regain control, to stitch together an image that had finally torn beyond repair. The real consequences would come later in daylight, when whispers turned into decisions and invitations quietly stopped arriving. I slipped my phone into my pocket and walked away from the building without looking back. They had spent years erasing me in rooms like that. Now they would spend years explaining why they no longer mattered in them. The night didn't end when I left the gala. It followed me home, humming under my skin, refusing to settle. The city outside my car window blurred into streaks of light as messages began to arrive, one after another, quiet confirmations that the real work had already started. No congratulations, no dramatic language, just acknowledgments, timelines, next steps. The kind of communication that meant decisions were being executed, not debated. By the time I reached my apartment, I knew sleep wasn't coming. I set my coat down, poured a glass of water, and stood at the window, watching traffic thread its way through the dark. Somewhere across town, people were still talking about what they'd seen. But the most important conversations weren't happening in ballrooms or over champagne. They were happening behind closed doors, where leverage mattered more than appearances. My phone rang once, then stopped. A message followed instead. "We're ready. Your call." I left again without changing, the city feeling sharper now, more awake. The building I entered an hour later was quiet, almost austere. No chandeliers, no music. Just glass, steel, and people who didn't waste words. I was led into a conference room where a small group was already seated, papers neatly arranged, screens dark and waiting. They stood when I entered. Not ceremoniously, reflexively. The conversation moved quickly. There was no need to revisit what had been decided earlier. We discussed terms, boundaries, timelines. Control wasn't something they offered me. It was something they recognized I already held. I listened, asked precise questions, made adjustments where needed. Each decision closed a door somewhere else, locking out anyone who believed proximity could substitute for preparation. At one point, someone mentioned the gala in passing, referring to it as if it were already a footnote. I didn't correct them. That night had served its purpose. It had revealed who understood power and who merely performed it. As the final terms were confirmed, a familiar calm settled over me. This was the room where I belonged, not because of blood or legacy, but because I had earned my seat. No one here cared where I'd been placed earlier in the evening. They cared about outcomes. When the meeting adjourned, it was nearly dawn. The city had softened, the edges blurred by early light. I stepped outside and let the cool air ground me, feeling the weight of what had just been set in motion. There was no turning back now. Whatever came next would arrive quickly. By mid-morning, the first calls started. Advisors checking in. A brief message from someone I trusted, confirming what I already suspected. The information had begun to move, quietly, efficiently. It would reach my family soon enough. I didn't warn them. There was no need. I spent the morning working, focused and deliberate. Tasks that had nothing to do with the gala, nothing to do with my parents or my brother or the woman who had smirked at me and called me useless. That chapter was already closing, whether they understood it or not. Around noon, a notification flashed across my screen. A board member I hadn't spoken to in years had requested a call. I let it go to voicemail. A few minutes later, an email arrived instead, carefully worded, seeking clarification. The tone was different than it would have been yesterday. Respect had a way of arriving once leverage became visible. I thought briefly of my parents, probably fielding their own calls now. Questions they couldn't answer. Assumptions unraveling. They had spent years believing they controlled access, that they could decide who mattered simply by where they placed them in a room. They were learning too late that real power didn't sit where you put it. It moved where it was needed. In the afternoon, a final confirmation came through. Everything was locked, decisions ratified, notifications sent. The process they'd tried to influence for months was complete, and they were nowhere in it. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for a moment, not out of exhaustion, but relief. This wasn't about humiliating anyone. It never had been. It was about choosing myself without apology, about refusing to contort my life to fit someone else's hierarchy. When I opened my eyes, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a missed call from my mother. I stared at the screen for a few seconds, then turned the phone face down on the desk. I wasn't ready for that conversation, and for once, I didn't feel guilty about it. As evening settled in, I left my office and walked home, the city moving around me with familiar indifference. People hurried past, each carrying their own private reckonings. Mine felt lighter now, grounded in something solid. By the time I reached my door, I knew the story had already escaped the rooms where it was born. It was out there, reshaping relationships, altering futures. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't demanded recognition. I had simply stopped stepping aside. And somewhere, not far from where I stood, my family was beginning to understand what it meant to lose control of a narrative they thought belonged to them. The world had a way of moving on once decisions were made. So did I. I woke to a quiet that felt deliberate, the kind that comes before something breaks. My phone lay face down on the nightstand, vibrating in short, insistent bursts. I didn't reach for it right away. I already knew what it would contain. When stories escape the rooms where they're born, they don't ask permission before they spread. By the time I made coffee, the notifications had stacked into a small, relentless tower. Missed calls, messages that began politely and grew more urgent with each attempt. A few alerts from outlets I recognized, their subject lines careful, non-committal, hungry. I read none of them. The silence I offered felt like the only honest response. The story was already moving without me. It moved through group chats and breakfast tables, through whispered asides and forwarded screenshots. It moved because people had seen something they weren't supposed to see, a hierarchy fail in public. Those moments linger. They invite retelling. Each version sharpened a different edge, but the center remained intact. The gala, the dismissal, the recognition, the walk away. I went into work and kept my schedule exactly as planned. Meetings started on time, decisions were made. No one mentioned my family, no one needed to. Respect arrived in the form of efficiency. Questions were asked directly. Answers were accepted without challenge. It was remarkable how quickly things simplified once the fog of assumption lifted. Around mid-morning, the calls to my parents began to surface in the periphery of my day, arriving secondhand. A colleague mentioned an abrupt cancellation. A partner asked carefully whether a certain name was still attached to a board they were considering. The tone wasn't accusatory. It was cautious. Influence doesn't disappear loudly. It thins. By noon, my mother's world had begun to shrink. I didn't hear this from her. I heard it from the space where her name used to land without friction, and now drew questions instead. Invitations paused. Chairs reconsidered. Committees asked for clarity. The language was gentle, but the message was firm. Optics matter, and once optics fracture, repair requires more than charm. My father tried to stabilize what he could. I could picture it easily. The measured calls, the reassurances, the insistence that everything was under control. But control depends on belief, and belief had taken a hit the night before. People don't forget seeing someone reach for power and find empty air. My brother called in the early afternoon. I watched the phone ring until it stopped. He called again a few minutes later, then sent a message. Just one line. "Can we talk?" I answered that one. We spoke briefly. His voice sounded unfamiliar, stripped of the confidence that usually framed it. He asked what had happened, as if the answer might be technical, something he could diagram and fix. I told him the truth, that nothing sudden had happened, that this was the result of years of decisions stacking in one direction. He didn't interrupt. When he apologized, it came out halting, unfinished. I didn't stop him, but I didn't fill the silence either. Some apologies need time to learn how to stand. Later, I heard about my sister-in-law through channels she couldn't control. She moved quickly, reaching out to contacts with practiced warmth, offering lunches and explanations and forward-looking statements. She framed herself as surprised, then concerned, then supportive. It worked on a few people. It didn't work on the ones who mattered most. When trust erodes, performance becomes visible. That's when the smiles stop landing. By late afternoon, I was asked to comment. The requests arrived dressed in courtesy, a brief quote, a clarification, a chance to set the record straight. I declined them all. Not out of spite, but restraint. I had learned that when people are eager to hear you speak, silence can do more work than any statement. The story was strongest, without my voice added to it. It read as truth, not defense. The irony wasn't lost on me. For years, my silence had been mistaken for insignificance. Now it read as authority. As the day wore on, a single message cut through the noise. It wasn't from the press or a colleague. It was from my mother. No subject line, no greeting, just a request to meet. The phrasing was careful, stripped of command. "Can we talk privately?" I didn't answer right away. I sat with the question longer than I needed to. Not because I feared the conversation, but because I wanted to be honest about what it would require. A private meeting meant no audience, no leverage through spectacle. It meant facing the truth without the buffer of performance. I wondered if she was ready for that. I wondered if I was. By evening, the city felt louder again, as if the day had finally caught up with itself. I left the office and walked, letting the movement clear my head. Storefronts glowed. People hurried past, carrying their own unfolding narratives. Somewhere not far from where I walked, my parents were realizing that the rooms they once commanded now asked questions before opening their doors. I stopped at a crosswalk and watched the light change, thinking about the difference between control and influence. Control demands compliance. Influence survives scrutiny. One collapses when exposed, the other endures. I answered my mother's message with a single sentence. Tomorrow, no audience. As I put my phone away, I felt something settle into place. The public story had done its work. What remained was personal, and heavier for it. People who controlled the narrative had lost it. Now they wanted a conversation. I crossed the street and kept walking. knowing the next day would bring the confrontation they could no longer postpone. When the story leaks, it doesn't just change how the world sees you. It changes how the people who raised you finally have to. They didn't summon me this time. That alone told me everything I needed to know. The message my mother sent was careful, almost polite, stripped of the authority she once wielded so effortlessly. No instructions, no expectations, just a request to talk. I agreed, not because I owed them anything, but because I wanted the conversation to end on my terms. We met the next afternoon in my parents' formal living room, the one reserved for guests they wanted to impress. The furniture was immaculate, untouched by real life, arranged to project taste and restraint. It felt smaller than I remembered. Or maybe I had simply grown. My parents were already there when I arrived. My father stood near the window, hands clasped behind his back, staring out as if the view might offer guidance. My mother sat rigidly on the sofa, posture perfect, expression guarded. My brother lingered near the doorway, uncertain where he belonged. My sister-in-law sat beside my mother, legs crossed, hands folded, her smile absent for once. No one told me where to sit. I chose a chair opposite them and waited. My mother spoke first. "We all feel that things got out of hand," she said carefully. Her tone was conciliatory, almost gentle. There was confusion, emotions were high. None of this needed to escalate the way it did. I listened without interrupting, noting how quickly she reframed humiliation as misunderstanding, how easily she smoothed over intent with language. It was a tactic I knew well. My father stepped in next. "We were trying to protect the family," he said, his voice tight. "You have to understand how things look. Appearances matter." "I do understand," I replied calmly. "That's the problem." The silence that followed was heavy. My brother shifted his weight, glancing between us. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than usual. "I didn't realize how bad it was," he said. "I should have said something. I should have stood up for you." I believed he meant it. I also knew it had taken losing ground for him to see the edge he'd been standing on all along. My sister-in-law leaned forward then, reclaiming her role instinctively. "We're family," she said smoothly. "What matters now is moving forward. There's no reason this can't benefit all of us. We can align, present a united front." There it was. The real purpose of the meeting, finally exposed. Not an apology, a negotiation. I let the moment stretch before answering. "This isn't about alignment," I said, "and it's not about optics." My mother stiffened. "You're being unfair." "No," I replied. "I'm being accurate." I spoke then, not loudly, not emotionally, but clearly. I named what had happened at the gala without embellishment. The lack of a seat, the comments, the assumption that I belonged behind the scenes. I described it the way one might outline a series of facts, undeniable and unsoftened. I didn't accuse, I didn't dramatize. I simply refused to let them rewrite it. "This conversation isn't about fixing your reputation," I continued, "and it's not about repairing an image. I'm not interested in partnerships or appearances. I'm not here to help you recover from consequences you created." My father's composure cracked. "You're punishing us." "I'm setting boundaries," I said. "There's a difference." My brother looked at the floor, shame etched into his posture. My sister-in-law's face tightened, calculation replacing charm. My mother's eyes flashed, anger flaring before she caught herself. "You're throwing away your family," she said sharply. I shook my head. "I'm acknowledging the one I actually had." The room fell quiet again, this time without pretense. For the first time, there was no performance left to maintain. Just 4 people confronted with the consequences of years of choices. I stood, not abruptly, not defiantly, just decisively. "This is where it ends," I said. "I'm not cutting you off. I'm not seeking revenge. I'm stepping out of a dynamic that only existed when I agreed to stay small. You're free to live however you choose. So am I." My father opened his mouth as if to argue, then stopped. There was nothing left to leverage. My mother said nothing, her silence louder than any protest. My brother looked up at me, eyes uncertain but honest. "I hope you figure things out," I said to him gently. Then I walked toward the door. No one followed. Outside, the air felt cooler, lighter. I stood on the front steps for a moment, letting the weight of the conversation settle. There was no sense of victory, no relief sharp enough to feel like joy. Just clarity. I had walked away from the people who once defined me, not in anger, but in truth. And as I drove away, I understood something I hadn't before. The hardest part of reclaiming your life isn't confronting the people who hurt you. It's accepting that they may never fully understand why you had to leave. The quiet that followed surprised me. Not the dramatic silence of a room emptied by conflict, but something softer, steadier. I woke the morning after the meeting without the familiar knot in my chest, without the instinct to brace myself for impact. For the first time in as long as I could remember, my day belonged entirely to me. I went to work and moved through my hours with an ease that felt earned. Meetings were efficient, conversations were direct, decisions landed where they should. No one treated me like a problem to be managed or a presence to be explained. I noticed how much energy I had been wasting for years, anticipating reactions that no longer mattered. News of my family reached me anyway, drifting in through neutral channels. I didn't seek it out, but I didn't avoid it either. My parents' influence continued to thin, not catastrophically, but unmistakably. Boards hesitated, invitations slowed. People who once deferred now asked questions first. Status, I learned, doesn't disappear in a single moment. It erodes, grain by grain, once belief cracks. I felt no satisfaction in watching it happen. Mostly I felt distance. My brother reached out again a few days later. This time, there was no urgency in his message, no attempt to fix or justify. Just a simple acknowledgement that he had been thinking, really thinking, about the past. When we spoke, his voice was quieter, stripped of the performance we'd both grown up with. He apologized without asking for absolution, and for the first time, I heard something real in it. "I didn't see it," he said. "Or maybe I didn't want to." "That matters," I replied. "Seeing it now matters." We didn't resolve everything in that conversation. We weren't suddenly close. But something shifted. The silence between us no longer felt like avoidance. It felt like space we were both learning how to navigate. I thought often about who I had been when I still lived inside my family's story. The difficult one, the embarrassment, the daughter who didn't understand how things worked. Those labels had followed me for years, shaping how I moved through the world, how much room I believed I was allowed to take up. Letting go of them felt like shedding a skin I'd outgrown. There were moments late at night when the cost of it all surfaced. Grief has a way of arriving quietly, without invitation. I mourned the family I had once hoped for, the version of my parents who might have chosen differently, the ease that comes from belonging without conditions. Success didn't erase that loss. It simply made it easier to carry. I learned that two things can be true at once. You can be free and still sad. You can be strong and still wish things had been different. The power I felt now was nothing like the kind my parents had chased. It didn't require an audience. It didn't depend on proximity or permission. It was rooted in choice, in clarity, in the knowledge that I no longer needed to explain myself to people committed to misunderstanding me. One afternoon, as I packed up to leave the office, I caught my reflection in the glass wall of the conference room. I barely recognized the woman looking back. Not because she looked different, but because she stood differently. Grounded, unapologetic, at ease. I realized then that I had stopped auditioning, stopped waiting for approval that was never going to come. The energy I had once poured into proving my worth had been redirected into building a life that reflected it naturally. That shift changed everything. The gala felt distant now, like a story that belonged to someone else. It had been a catalyst, not a destination. The real transformation had happened afterward, in the quiet decisions, The boundaries held, the refusal to step back into roles that no longer fit. One evening, as I walked home through streets softened by dusk, my phone buzzed with a message that had nothing to do with my family. An opportunity. Unexpected, meaningful, aligned with the work I cared about. I smiled, not because it was a victory, but because it felt like forward motion unburdened by the past. I paused at a crosswalk and watched the city move around me, people flowing in every direction, each carrying stories no one else could see. For the first time, my own story felt fully mine. Not defined by who had dismissed me or who had failed to show up. Defined by who I had become. I understood then that revenge had never been my goal. Truth was. Dignity was. The ability to stand in my life without shrinking to make others comfortable. As the light changed and I stepped forward, I felt something settle into place, steady and unshakable. The fall had already happened. The aftermath was quieter, deeper, more lasting, and for the first time, I wasn't waiting for anything else to happen. Time moved forward in a way it never had before, not urgently, not anxiously, but steadily, like something finally set on the right course. Weeks passed, then months, and the gala faded into the background of my life, no longer a defining moment but a reference point I rarely needed to revisit. My family still existed, of course, just at a distance that felt intentional. My parents retreated into a smaller version of the world they once dominated. They were still comfortable, still well-housed, still surrounded by reminders of what they used to control. But the grand momentum was gone. Influence no longer arrived automatically. Invitations required effort. Conversations came with hesitation. They were learning what it meant to live without an audience that assumed their importance. My sister-in-law adapted the way she always did, curating a new circle, smiling a little harder, posting a little louder. It worked in places where people valued performance over substance. It didn't reach me, and it didn't need to. Her world and mine no longer intersected. My brother remained the one loose thread. We spoke occasionally, cautiously, rebuilding something unfamiliar but honest. He was still figuring out who he was without the script he'd been handed. I didn't rush him. Growth takes time, especially when it starts later than it should have. As for me, my days filled with work that mattered, conversations that didn't require translation, and relationships built on choice rather than obligation. I no longer felt the need to explain my background, to soften my success, or to shrink myself to preserve someone else's comfort. The energy I once spent navigating my family's expectations had been freed, and I was using it fully. One afternoon, I hosted a small meeting in a room that belonged entirely to me. Not borrowed, not inherited, built. As I listened to ideas being exchanged freely around the table, I caught myself smiling. This was what belonging felt like, not approval, not tolerance, respect. The memory of standing near the service corridor came back to me then, sharp and distant at the same time. The way I'd been told to know my place, the way silence had been mistaken for weakness. I understood now that the most damaging lie I'd been taught wasn't that I didn't matter. It was that my worth depended on where others decided to seat me. I had built my own table. Revenge, I learned, isn't always loud. It doesn't require humiliation or spectacle. Sometimes it's simply the refusal to keep protecting people from the consequences of how they treat you. Sometimes it's walking away and living well enough that your absence becomes impossible to ignore. There were nights when I still felt the ache of what could have been. I won't pretend otherwise. Family loss is complicated, layered with memory and hope and grief. But that ache no longer controlled me. It existed alongside gratitude for the life I had chosen and built, and it no longer felt like a wound, just a scar. Standing on my balcony one evening, watching the city lights flicker on, I felt something settle deep inside me. A sense of completion. Not closure in the cinematic sense, but acceptance. I didn't need my parents' recognition to validate my choices. I didn't need my brother's defense to justify my boundaries. I didn't need anyone to rewrite the past for me to move forward. I was no longer the invisible daughter. I was a woman who knew her worth without waiting for permission. My phone buzzed with a message from a colleague, then another from a friend. Plans, ideas, life unfolding in directions that felt expansive instead of constrained. I smiled and typed a quick reply, then set the phone aside and let the moment breathe. If you've ever been treated as if you only mattered when you were useful, if you've ever been told to know your place by the very people who should have protected you, you're not alone. Stories like mine aren't rare. They're just rarely told out loud. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear yours. Share it in the comments. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is remind each other that we're not imagining the injustice, and we're not wrong for walking away from it. And if you want to stay with me, if you want more stories about real power reversals, quiet revenge, and reclaiming dignity without apology, consider subscribing to the channel. This is a space for truth, boundaries, and the kind of strength that doesn't need to shout. They told me to know my place. It turns out the most powerful place I could ever stand was the one I chose for myself.